Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Stanford University historian Peter Stansky. During our conversation, Peter talks about the life of George Orwell, the two biographies he wrote about Orwell, and the relevance of his novels in modern times. Welcome to the show. Today I'm sitting down with Peter Stansky, and we're going to be talking about George Orwell. Peter is a professor at Stanford University. And Peter, I just wanted to say first, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Not at all. My pleasure.
Thank you. I'd love to start by learning a little bit about you personally and how you got interested in Orwell as a subject matter. Did you experience Orwell when you were young and decided that he was a subject that you wanted to explore more in your academic career?
Yes. Well, as a matter of fact, I'm quite aware of this at the moment because there was a reception on Thursday night done by the Yale University Library, where I was an undergraduate. And it was at Yale, actually, that I had my first contact with Orwell. This was... Well, actually, I entered. Let's see. He died. I keep forgetting whether he died in 49 or 50. I think January 50. I entered Yale in 49. Of course, Orwell was very famous, fame came late to him with the publication of first Animal Farm and then 1984. But before that, he'd been a moderately well-known English novelist. But I became very interested at Yale. Became interested in England, and also I had a long-term interest in the Spanish Civil War. And so in my senior essay, for the history department, I combined these interests, and I wrote about four Englishmen who were involved in the Spanish Civil War. Of course, George Orwell, Stephen Spender being the best known, and then two comparatively unknown young men who were actually killed in the war, one as a soldier, one as a ambulance driver, John Cornford and Julian Bell. And so that was of course I had read Orwell's. I think I remember when 1984 was published. I think my parents belonged to the Book of the Month Club, and I think it was famously a selection of that. Now, I think I must have read it then. I can't remember whether I read Animal Farm early on. I certainly hadn't read the earlier novels. But the excitement really tied in with the Yale University Library is a lot of the famous essays had not been collected together. And going through into the stacks of the library and finding those essays in various periodicals was great fun. And so the shape of it tended to be, it ended with this, which was also the shape of the subsequent publications on Orwell. It ended with just shortly his experiences through the Spanish Civil War, which, of course, I think were extremely important. And, of course, it was just about this time, his great book on the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia, which had been published, of course, in the 30s. It had gotten not very favorable reviews because a lot of people felt that one had to support the communists, as that was the only possible solution for defeating Franco, which in many ways was a valid point. And Orwell as being very much anti-communist in Homage to Catalonia. The book received mixed reviews and didn't get that much attention, though it got some. Then copies were destroyed in the Blitz. But then, I've forgotten the exact date, it was reissued just around 52 or something, with a famous introduction, but I think in a way misguided introduction by the great literary critic Lionel Trilling. And it got a lot of attention. It also, of course, and some people overemphasize this, but it's also a factor. Its publication was also a function, in some degree, a function of the Cold War, because as a strongly anti-communist book, it was a powerful statement against the communists. But also it's a wonderful book. It's a magnificent book, and so my interest, that was my interest in Orwell, and then I went on. I went to England to study, and then I almost became a lawyer, but then I decided I would be a historian, and I wrote a dissertation about British politics. But then I met this editor and author and novelist and poet, William Abrams, and we wrote an article together, and he said, well, maybe we should do something else together. And I showed him my senior thesis, and so we embarked on doing that project. But then, for various reasons, we published a book called Journey to the Frontier about Julian Bell and John Cornford, the two comparatively unknown Englishmen who were at the very young age. One was John Cornford was 21, Julian Bell was 28 when they were killed. Originally, we were going to write about the four, but we decided to divide it. And then after doing that book, we turned to writing about Orwell. And so we published, I think in 1972, a book called The Unknown Orwell, which covered his life. It was sort of a critical biography, but it just went up to his life, to the publication of, I think, the dates are subject to correction. I don't remember them all absolutely. I think it was 1932 or 33 when Down and Out in Paris and London was published, which was his use of his pseudonym, George Orwell. So the first book ended with the publication of Down and Out in Paris and London. And then the second book, Orwell, The Transformation, fundamentally ended with the Spanish Civil War. And we found, during the time of the Spanish Civil War, he wrote a letter to Frank Jelinek, which actually in the 4-volume, the earlier collected version, the 4 volumes of Orwell's allegedly collected, but I mean, it was far from complete, used as it stamped on the binding of the book. It was one of the few times that he signed a letter. He signed it both Eric Blair and George Orwell. And our argument, which some people thought was too schematic in the book, was that he became Orwell through the experience he was becoming Orwell between the publication of Down and Out in Paris and London and the experience of the Spanish Civil War, but he sort of became Orwell through Spain. And this persona, who we believe believed in socialism, but then also saw that socialism was perverted, and the bittersweet, or the message, of course, of both 1984 and Animal Farm, in my view, is socialism is a good thing. It's what should happen, but the only way for it to be successful is the people who achieve the socialist society, the leaders, have to be immediately replaced. Because if they're not replaced, they become concerned with power, as with the pigs in Animal Farm, as with this Big Brother and his supporters in 1984. That you have to have so he was both this combination of what the world should be like, but also the hopelessness of it. I think, I fear of it happening.
What was surprising to you as you began to research the young Orwell? What things or details or specifics about his life came up that were interesting to you or memorable to you?
I'm not quite sure I can answer that question. Of course, his life was fascinating. I'm not so sure. Being surprised sort of suggests that I had sort of preconceptions, which I hope I didn't have. I'm a historian, and I'm not a literary critic, and my main thrust is I study I want to study somebody like Orwell, and in lots of my other work, this is similar. In part because, it's a fascinating story, and he's obviously an important person, although I appreciate that as a writer, it's his writing, which is the most important, is more important than the life. But also, I'm intrigued by what such a life, and this is putting on my hat as a historian of Britain, what such a life can tell you about British society. And actually, what fascinates me in particular, which is true of Orwell's case and true of others, is this what you might call a gentlemanly radicalism, and also the intense class consciousness in British society. I mean, as you remember, I'm sure Orwell famously characterizes himself as a member of the lower, upper middle class, and this the family was not particularly well off, but they were descended, as we point out at the beginning of the book. They had this semi-aristocratic connection going back several centuries. I mean, with the Earls of Westmoreland, the Blairs were country vicars. In his grandfather, I think, if I remember correctly, which I may not, was a vicar. His father was a civil servant. Interestingly, in the opium trade, in the British government cultivation and growing of opium in India. So they were socially upper class, but as he points out, class in England, families may have gotten into the upper class through money, but somehow they frequently stay in that class even when they may not have very much money. And the whole business of his education, I mean, he went to this prep school with as you know, the school where English boys, women, girls too, but mostly boys, go to boarding school at the age of 7 or 8, incredibly young. And of course, he wrote that wonderful, wonderful essay, Such Were the Joys, about his prep school experience, which could not be published. It was published in America in the Partisan Review. It was published after his death, I believe. There's some people say, it didn't mean to be published, but I can't believe that's true. I don't think a writer writes not to be published. And but it couldn't be published in England until after the death of the headmistress of the school, Mrs. Vaughan Wilkes, whom Billy Abrams and I went to see. We hadn't particularly meant to go to see her, but we went to interview when we were working on the book Cyril Connolly, who of course had been a contemporary, the famous literary critic, who had been a contemporary of Orwell's, both at St. Cyprian's, had been at school with him at St. Cyprian's, the same prep school, and also at Eton, and which of course is in many ways the most famous boarding school in England. And we went to interview Cyril Connolly in the south of England, in Eastbourne, near Eastbourne, and in Sussex, I think it is. And he said, well, you should go and see Mrs. Vaughan Wilkes. And she's still alive. We said, oh, yes. He said, oh, you must go. And we arranged to go. But and it was quite extraordinary to see her. She said, poor little Eric. I tried to be good to him. But she's clearly a very powerful lady. But we said to Cyril Connolly, who after all was an incredibly eminent literary critic, have you seen her? He said, no, are you out of your mind? I'd be too scared. And then years later, I think, or not that long after, when she died, he said, I did go to her funeral. I did want to be sure that she was dead. But then there's a wonderfully sort of academic dispute which is in a way rather hysterical, which is traced to a degree in the footnotes to the great Peter Davison edition of Orwell's work. And the annotations for such were the joys. Apparently there's a question, an important question, about whether or not Orwell was a bedwetter. Because in the piece, in the wonderful essay, such were the joys, he says he was a bedwetter. But various contemporaries of his at St. Cyprian's, and that he's much punished by Mrs. Vaughan Wilkes because of this or whatever. And but some people believe that in fact it was another boy, not Orwell, who was the bedwetter, and that Orwell took this guilt, so to speak, upon himself in order to make his story more vivid. But I became fascinated also by sort of the paradox. He wrote a famous essay published, I think it was published in New Writing, and again, it's I'm always fascinated by the interconnectedness of English society. The important literary figure, he was a great friend of Julian Bell, the person we wrote about. An important literary figure in the writers of the 30s in Britain was John Layman, who was Orwell's fag, schoolboy servant. Nothing to do with sexuality in although it might in a sense, at Eton, and was the editor of this publication called New Writing, and I think which in fact was either shooting an elephant or a hanging, or maybe both. Were published in New Writing, which very important early Orwell essays, but Orwell wrote, I think, for New Writing, an essay called "My Country, Right or Left," and patriotism was sort of beaten into the boys. Of course, he was at the prep school during the First World War, and as you probably know, we discovered somebody had suggested we look for it. So we had Ian Angus, who was an Orwell scholar, suggested that we look at the Henley newspaper, and of course, Orwell's, as you may know, Orwell's first two publications as a schoolboy were two patriotic poems, one on the death of Kitchener, and one saying that people should enlist in the army. But there's just been a recent piece that apparently the army piece was tied in with somebody he knew, or somebody who was a semi-relation or something like that, who had been killed in the had been killed in the war.
Talk to me about the intellectual growth or progress of Orwell. What brought him from a semi-aristocratic young man?
Well, aristocratic's a little too strong, but aristocratic background.
Background,
yeah,
and then having patriotic sentiments to a man that volunteers to fight in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, what was the intellectual progress?
At the very beginning, but from very early on, he was, I think, in a sort of. I wouldn't quite say conflicted, but I think he had doubt. I don't think he was always a skeptic, and I think he was always, questioned the patriotism, and questioned his education, questioned the class aspects of the education. But at the same time, he got a very good education. I think at these schools, I think the kids are frequently taught how to write. So, I think that his writing skills, I think, were improved. But I think he moves to the left on the basis of seeing poverty and the impression. And down and out in Paris and London. Also, there's the famous In the Clergyman's Daughter, which is, a rather shambolic novel in many ways, but there are the wonderful scenes about hop picking. There's the spending the night in Trafalgar Square. The poverty, of course, made much worse by the Depression in England. I think moved into the left, and then he's commissioned, or it's arranged that he write for the Left Book Club, which was a very important organization, the Road to Wigan Pier. And although he's more or less says he's a socialist, but of his own peculiar kind, and he's very critical of those who support socialism, particularly those such as himself, who are middle class and upper middle class supporters of socialism. And his criticisms of socialism was so, in the view of Victor Gollancz, the publisher and creator of the Left Book Club, that Gollancz wrote an introduction saying where he disagreed with Orwell. But then I think so he feels that socialism is a good thing, and he gets caught up. I think Spain became the great cause, but initially he went there as a reporter, and that he was going to write about it. And then he arrived in Barcelona in whenever it was, January. The war had been going for some time, or maybe December or November, but some months after the war had embarked. And he was just overwhelmed by the egalitarian atmosphere of Barcelona. And he felt, this is something that I have to fight for. And so he enlisted in the POUM militia, which was a semi-Trotskyite organization, which was sort of coincidental. I mean, that was just the militia he ran across. And in fact, he thought that they ran things very inefficiently. And when he came to Barcelona later on, in the May days, the following May, when there was fighting, internecine fighting in Barcelona between the communists and the anarchists and the POUM and so forth, he was actually wanting to transfer to the International Brigade, which he thought was going to be more efficient. But then when he came to Barcelona and saw that his comrades in the POUM were being attacked, he felt, those were the people he were with, and he both had a sense of the dream of socialism, but then that it was being betrayed, which is true, that it was being betrayed by the communists. The paradox is the communist idea of fighting the war more efficiently might have been the only way to win it. But whether the ideals should be sacrificed for the practicality. But in any case, it was the worst of both possible worlds. The ideals were sacrificed, and they didn't win.
Talk about the division, the rift in the left during the Spanish Civil War between the communists and the socialists. What was driving that division, and what was really Orwell's attraction to socialism? What was it about it specifically that made him
egalitarianism and equality. But the famous line is, in Spain, I became a socialist, believe in socialism as I understand it. And exactly what he means by that is a little unclear. The rift was really that, the communists were determined to subject what happened in Spain to Russian policy. That Russian policy was the be all and end all, and they were of course it was also it was the fault, of course, of the Western powers, France, the United States, Britain. Who wouldn't supply arms, so wouldn't sell arms to Spain. The Russians sold arms, and the Spanish gold went to Moscow, I believe. But Russia was the only country that Mexico helped a little bit, and maybe some things were smuggled from France. But Russia was the only country that would help, and the Russians were, Stalin was totally paranoid about the Trotskyites and the enemies on the left, and was determined to. And the anarchists, and was determined to. It was more important, I think. Well, I'm not an expert really on communist policy, but it was more important to the communists to eliminate their left-wing enemies, I think, than to win the war. And Orwell's, and that they would lie. I mean, the whole point. The origins, I think, obviously, of the Ministry of Truth in 1984 which is Winston Smith's task, is to rewrite the past, and Orwell saw the communists and their supporters, including fellow travelers, and he became a sort of and I have mixed feelings about that. The enemies list, which I don't know if you know about that, at the end of his life, that he compiled this list of people who are unreliable, who shouldn't be trusted because they were fellow travelers. I think he tended a bit to see Reds under the beds. But it is true that expediency. I mean, the line was, we have to tell lies, we have to kill people to serve the Soviet good. The ultimate good is the strengthening and the preservation of the Soviet state. And Orwell didn't agree.
You mentioned the change in him, sort of Eric Blair becoming George Orwell following the Spanish Civil War. Talk about the man after the war. I know he was shot in the throat and nearly died in the Spanish Civil War, and previously actually had spent some time in Burma before he fought in the Spanish Civil War. What was the difference in Orwell after the Spanish Civil War? Where did he live?
There are also consistencies. I mean, it's a digression, but of course, I mean, I think one. It doesn't answer your question, but I mean, I would like to mention that I think Shooting an Elephant is one of the greatest essays ever written, but also it again sort of sums up Orwell's realism in that it people who oppose the empire tended to romanticize the people who are being dominated. And I think what's wonderful about Shooting an Elephant is it says that being in imperial power puts one in a totally false position, and that you have to do terrible things, shooting this elephant, in fact, who was recovered, because you have to play the role of the ruler. So the corruptions of empire, and I guess there's a great theme in all through of the corruption of power. That if you have power, it does terrible things to you. But remind me of the question.
The difference between Orwell, between prior to the Spanish Civil War and after, how did the man change?
Well, no, I think difference is perhaps too strong a word. I think he evolves. He evolves, and I mean, I think that the tendencies, as I was trying to suggest, in terms of his attitude towards empire, are there already. But I think the importance of the Spanish Civil War is he vividly sees how wonderful, in his view. Well, I think he's right. How wonderful an egalitarian society could be, and how easy it is to be destroyed. And I think, and so having that vision, he can put it forward into his two greatest works of fiction, Animal Farm in 1984. But the whole aspect of Orwell, which actually is sort of separate, that is in a way, well, in a sense, is tied in, of course, with his political development. But as a great writer and as a inventor or creator or pioneer in what you might call the sociology of a country. I mean, his looking at the social significance, his great essay on Dickens, his great, of course, Politics in the English Language, and his great attention, The Art of Donald McGill, the wonderful essays where he looks at the social, what these cultural artifacts. In many ways, I don't think he's quite been given his due as an inventor of cultural history. I mean, how you look at in profound ways. I mean, people had looked at these things in the past, but I think that what these things mean. The comic postcards, the dirty, semi-dirty postcards that were sold at the seaside. What these tell you about society. And he also famously wrote the essay in defense of P.G. Wodehouse and Raffles and Miss Blandish. I mean, the thing is, he had a wonderful sense of the importance and significance of popular culture, which was, comparatively, people read these things, but to talk about them as historically significant. And, they were, he was interested in, in a sense, well, maybe it's a stretch, but in a sense you can say it has something to do with socialism in that it's, what people enjoy is he wasn't a snob.
The book 1984. I mean, it seemed like in his life he lived almost in a Dickensian way in some capacities. I mean, I know the way that he died without getting his TB treated, and he basically suffocated.
Well, he was
to
treated. I mean, he could have. Well, I mean, he took terrible care of himself, but he was in a sanatorium and occasionally, and of course, he was. If penicillin had not penicillin, what was sulfur drugs or something, he might have been saved. I mean, he took terrible care of himself, but he was. But I mean, I don't think it was sort of. Well, you wouldn't say I mean, he wasn't religious, but he was sort of a natural ascetic. But I don't think he cared very much about. He didn't have much money, of course, until Animal Farm. But even so, I just think his personal style of living was austere, and it was absolutely crazy. To Orwell, I must give you a brochure. I have to urge you to join the Orwell Society. Remind me to give you a brochure about it. But that he wrote 1984 in Jura, which can have been a healthy place to live. He didn't take proper care of himself. But remind me, I don't think I'm quite answering your question.
Just in talking about 1984, what is it about that book that you think speaks to people? It's almost more than a half a century since the publication of that novel, and it still seems to resonate with people.
It is more than a half a century.
Well, why is that? What's so important about that book that speaks to the general universality of human nature or humanity at large?
Well, I think in one sense, maybe in a far less sweeping sense, I think it's incredibly predictive, which maybe hasn't been given enough credit to. I mean, it's a primitive form of computers, and Winston Smith is rewriting the past, and now that's much more possible than it could have been before. I mean, this whole business of because I just saw a little piece about this somewhere. Of when you cite something from the web, you give the date in which you cite it. And as I understand it, the reason for that is, of course, it can be changed. And if somebody looks at it and says, well, it's not there. It's not that it wasn't there on the date that you cited it. While a book, presumably that wouldn't happen. So I think one of its sources of fascination is just that it predicted the modern world and how the past could be rewritten and how the past could be manipulated. I mean, it's always been manipulated in the sense that it's reinterpreted, but that it could actually be changed through these mechanical means. But then the power of propaganda and that power. We're just in. I think I can't quite remember, but I mean, Brian says, we're in it for power. We don't have an ideology. That power is the name of the game, and also I think it alas, which seems to me more true today than it was been for. When you read the newspapers. The world is full of fighting.
In all of your research of Orwell, are there things that are still not well known about him that you wish more people were aware of?
Yes. What I mentioned earlier that the famous Lionel Trilling introduction to Homage to Catalonia. Emphasized his truth telling, and I actually think he's not a truth teller. He's something greater, in my view. He's an artist, and I think his main interest was to be a craftsman of words, and. I think he's too frequently seen as a commentator, or somebody who's telling truth, which to a great degree is true. But I think his to me his ultimate interest is his great extraordinary skill as a writer. And I think that frequently is not given its proper due.
The last question I want to ask you is about him as a man and the personality of George Orwell. What was it about him that propelled him to want to dedicate his life to words and writing and defying the culture of the time? Did he have you mentioned earlier that he was a gentleman, but also rebellious or a revolutionary. Was there just a
he wasn't necessarily. It wasn't necessarily the nicest of men. I mean, I think Graham Bowker's biography exaggerates his role as a sexual predator, whatever the word is. I think in many ways he had a very happy marriage with Eileen. And then just about to be an anniversary of who died tragically with a hysterectomy operation. The elements of anti-Semitism in George Orwell, the elements of homophobia in George Orwell. But the question again?
What was it about him that allowed him to produce these great works? Was there a fire burning in George Orwell that most people just don't have?
Oh no! I think the political aim to create a better society, but as I tried to suggest earlier, I think he's more driven by the aim to be as good and important a writer, as a literary figure, as he could be. And it so happened that the novels had great political content. The essays have sort of political content and sociological content. But I think that if I remember correctly, the essay "Inside the Whale," where I think he talks about the importance of literature. I mean, I think he was driven to be. I mean, why does somebody want to be writer. I think that's because after all, he went into the family business, so to speak, becoming a policeman, a police officer in Burma. And actually, I think this is, I don't know when you want to conclude, but may be inappropriate. It sort of ties in what you're saying and what you're asking. He gives up. He comes on home leave after whatever it is, 5 years in Burma. He decides he's not going to go back. He decides he wants to be a writer. That's decision number one. I'm going to be a writer. First question, what am I to write about? I'm going to go be a hobo in England, and I'm going to live in Paris, after all, the famous literary place, but I'm going to get a job in a restaurant as a dishwasher. Why am I doing these things? I'm doing these things not for a political reason, not necessarily not to earn money or not to fill up my time, but to acquire material to write about. So I think his drive to be a writer was as I say, I don't think it's given enough attention to, is a primary drive, and then having the experiences. It provides the material of what he writes about, but in the course of it, his political vision develops, and he sees this wonderful egalitarian society although it wasn't quite as good as he thought it was, and it had been more egalitarian in the very first months of the Spanish Civil War. But that this was which essay is it? Looking back on the Spanish Civil War, where he shakes hands with the Spanish militiaman, and also human connection. I mean that he felt he was connected with this man, and they were fighting on the same side. Brotherhood and comradeship, and maybe there's an element of the sort of the intense sort of class consciousness and individualism of people of his class, and being through the political situation, being able to make contact. And of course, in 1984, there's Orwell sort of irritated his friends by how you're supposed to drink tea and how you're supposed to put tea in the saucer. And of course, there's this wonderful class. Everything in England has almost everything, or virtually everything in England has class connotations, and the English middle and upper class put the milk in their tea after the tea has been poured in. The working class put milk in their tea first, and then Orwell, I think, but he was a member of the lower upper middle class, as he said, but he was trying to ape the man, and his friends sort of made fun of him, I think, about it. He tried to ape a sort of to some sense a working class style. But at the same time, again, it's sort of summed up in 1984, where at one point it says, if there's hope in the proles. But I think that's at the very time that when he's thinking that the secret police crash through the mirror or whatever it is. I may have that slightly wrong. But he's both saying... and also, of course, the great theme in English literature, which is in 1984 and also in Animal Farm, is and very much in Coming Up for Air, the countryside and the ruination of in Coming Up for Air, how the countryside has been ruined, how the countryside in a sense has been ruined through the pigs, with the transformation of the pigs in Animal Farm. But the Golden Country in 1984, where Winston and Julia make love, is the countryside. but at the same time they're fearful, or it may be might. So it's both this idealistic England and how it's threatened.
And to follow up on that, is there in the world today, in your judgment, is there a country that Orwell would view maybe not as his perfect idealized country in it's the way it's designed in the egalitarianism of the nation, but is there a country in your judgment or countries that he would point to as at least moving in that direction, or a country to be lauded?
I doubt it very much. I mean, no, Orwell was a naysayer. I mean, Orwell was a critic. He loved England. The famous last paragraph of course, what we haven't mentioned is his wonderful essay or little book, The Lion and the Unicorn, and where he says, England is the greatest country in the world, or something like that, but with the wrong people in control. And so I think he, I don't believe in asking the question, what would somebody like Orwell say about the world today? Because I think what that tends to happen is it turns out what Orwell should say about the world today is what the person asking the question wishes to hear. And it's wonderful in 1984, where Norman Podhoretz represented the sort of right-wing interpretation of Orwell as being anti-socialist, and Christopher Hitchens the left-wing interpretation that Orwell was a socialist. And then in 2003, we're at a much less active level, but there are a fair number of events to mark the centenary of Orwell's birth. Christopher Hitchens was the right-wing interpretation of Orwell, and others, Stephen Collini and Louis Manan and so forth, of the more left-wing interpretation of Orwell.
Peter, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.